The Atlantic had no mercy that evening. It hurled cold wind off the water and dragged it through every narrow cobblestone lane of Cascais like it was searching for someone, punishing every soul still foolish enough to be standing outside. Ginica was one of them. She stood on the wet street outside a Casa do Mar, the little seaside cafe that had become the only place in Portugal that felt anything close to safe. The warm amber glow from its windows spilled across the cobblestones at her feet. Behind the glass, ordinary people ate ordinary meals and laughed at ordinary things. She had forgotten what ordinary felt like. One hand pressed gently against the curve of her stomach. 6 months. 6 months since she had boarded a midnight flight out of Incheon Airport with nothing but 2 suitcases, a broken heart, and a secret she hadn't even known she was carrying yet. 6 months since she had listened at a door she should never have approached, heard a voice she loved more than her own life, and understood, with the terrible clarity that only betrayal can bring, that she had never been chosen. She had been hidden. And her sister had been promised. The wind shifted. Something prickled at the back of her neck. The particular stillness that comes before something irreversible. Ginica had learned to trust that feeling. In 2 years of loving a man the underworld called the Dragon of Busan, it had saved her more than once. She turned slowly. A black SUV sat motionless beside the harbor wall. No plates she recognized, engine still running. The kind of vehicle that didn't belong in a quiet fishing town, and made no effort to pretend otherwise. The rear door opened. One hand appeared first. Pale, ringed, a black dragon tattoo curling from knuckle to wrist like smoke frozen in skin. Then the rest of him unfolded from the car, 6'2", black turtleneck, long Mafia overcoat so dark it seemed to pull the night around him. Hair swept back from a face that was all sharp angles and cold intelligence. A face that had made generals nervous and billionaires sweat. A face she had spent 6 months trying to forget, Feng Chiu. He stood perfectly still in the rain, the way predators do when they have finally cornered what they've been hunting. No urgency, no need to rush, just that absolute terrible composure that meant the search was over. He was looking at her. Ginica couldn't breathe. Her hand pressed harder against her stomach, instinct, pure and fierce, as if she could shield what was inside her from the weight of his gaze, as if she could rewind the last 6 months. As if she could be anyone else on any other cobblestone street in any other country in the world. His eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, down from her face, past her coat, to the undeniable, unmistakable curve beneath it. Everything in Feng Chiu's expression went very, very still. Not the controlled stillness of power, something else. Something cracking open beneath the surface of a man who had spent 6 months crossing 3 continents, burning through investigators, refusing every distraction, and had just understood, in a single glance under a Portuguese street lamp, exactly what he had almost lost. The rain fell between them, cold, relentless, filling the silence neither of them could break. Because the woman he had turned the underworld upside down searching for was standing 15 feet away from him, carrying his child. And in the shattered space between one heartbeat and the next, every lie, every orchestrated word, every truth that had been weaponized against both of them, waited, trembling, to finally come apart. Before we continue, if you overheard the person you loved making what sounded like a promise to someone else, would you confront them, or would you quietly disappear? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you love mafia romance, hidden pregnancies, and stories where the truth hits harder than any villain ever could, please like, share, and subscribe. There's so much more of this story still to tell. Seoul had a way of swallowing secrets whole. 12 million people pressed into a city that never fully slept, and inside that beautiful, relentless noise, 2 people had built something no one was supposed to find. Ginica had come to Korea for fabric, for the textile districts of Dongdaemun, for the way Korean designers married structure with softness, for the possibility of building her fashion label somewhere that hadn't yet decided who she was allowed to be. She had not come for Feng Chiu. He had simply appeared, the way dangerous things often do, without warning and without apology. She had been loading bolts of silk into a taxi outside a supplier's warehouse in Yeonggu when his motorcade blocked the road. 3 black vehicles. Men in dark suits materializing from nowhere. And then him, stepping out of the middle car to speak to someone on the pavement, close enough that she could see the dragon tattoo curling across his right hand. Close enough that when he glanced over and found her staring, there was nowhere to look away to. He had smiled, not the smile of a man performing charm. Something quieter than that. Something almost surprised. 2 weeks later, his assistant had delivered an envelope to her studio in Mapogu. Inside, a single card with a restaurant address and a time. No name, no explanation. Just the faint impression of that dragon tattoo pressed in black ink at the bottom corner. She should have thrown it away. She went instead. That was the thing about Feng Chiu that no one on the outside could ever understand. Not the rivals who feared him. Not the politicians who took his money. Not the journalists who built careers theorizing about what moved beneath his composure. He was not the man the underworld described, or rather, he was that man completely, and also something else entirely when the doors were closed and the performance was no longer required. With Jenica, he was quiet, curious. He asked about her designs, the way people ask about things they genuinely cannot figure out, turning her sketches in his hands, tracing the structural lines with one finger. He cooked for her exactly once, badly, and laughed at himself in a way she had never expected from. Someone the Busan underworld called the Dragon, he read. He remembered small things she mentioned in passing and produced them weeks later without fanfare. A specific tea she had described from childhood. A Portuguese phrasebook when she mentioned once that she had always wanted to learn. She fell in love with him the way you fall into deep water. Slowly at first, and then all at once, and then with the sudden terrible realization that the bottom was very far away. 2 years passed like that, hidden and warm and entirely hers. He never promised her a future out loud. That was the thing she would return to later, turning it over like a stone she kept finding in her pocket. He had never said forever, but he had acted like it. He had woven her into his life in every way that couldn't be named, trusted her with pieces of himself he gave no one else, protected her with a ferocity that went far beyond what a secret could justify. Looked at her sometimes across a quiet room with an expression that made her chest ache with something close to certainty. She had believed, without the words ever being spoken, that she had been chosen. She had been wrong. Her sister arrived in Seoul on a Thursday. A daisy traveled the way she did everything, perfectly assembled, slightly theatrical, filling every room she entered with a particular energy of someone who had decided long ago that the world owed her its full attention. She was older than Jenica by 4 years and beautiful in a way that announced itself immediately, all glossy edges and expensive perfume, and a smile that could convince you of almost anything. Jenica had loved her without reservation for most of her life. She had shown Adeye's everything, the studio, the market streets, the view from her apartment on a clear morning when Seoul stretched out gold and endless. She had not shown her Fengqiu, because Fengqiu was not something she was allowed to show anyone, but she had been happy that week, quietly, privately happy, because he had been different lately, more present, less guarded, and she had let herself believe it meant something was about to shift between them. On the 5th night of Adeza's visit, Fengqiu called. He asked her not to come to him that evening. He had business, private business. She hadn't questioned it, she never did, and had agreed easily enough, spending the first half of the evening in the studio and the second half walking toward his building anyway, because her hands had been restless all day and she had wanted just briefly to be near something that felt solid. She had not intended to stay. She had not intended to hear anything. The private meeting room on the 2nd floor had its door pulled nearly closed, a sliver of warm light falling across the corridor floor. She had stopped because she heard her sister's voice first, Adeye's voice, low and deliberate, and the shock of it had rooted her feet to the marble. Then Fengqiu's voice. She had caught fragments, enough. Her sister's name, spoken with the particular gravity Fengqiu reserved for things that mattered. The word family, the word arrangement. And then, clear and unmistakable, 4 words in the careful formal Korean he used when he meant something to last. I will marry you. The corridor seemed to tilt. Jenica pressed one hand flat against the wall and breathed through her nose, the way you do when the ground moves beneath. You need to convince your body that it hasn't. She waited, some irrational part of her, for the rest of the sentence, for the context that would make those 4 words into something other than what they sounded like. For a laugh, a correction, a misunderstanding she could fold herself into. Nothing came. She walked back through the building, down the stairs, out through the lobby, across 3 blocks of Seoul's cold night air, into her studio where she sat on the floor between 2 dress forms until her hands stopped shaking, enough to book a flight. She did not cry until she was on the plane. She did not stop for a very long time after that. Portugal received her the way quiet places receive broken people, without ceremony, without questions, with simply the gift of being somewhere no one knew her name. She found a small apartment above a tile shop in Cascais, took on remote work for a European label that didn't know or care where she was sitting when she sent her sketches, and began the careful, exhausting project of building a life from the wreckage of the one she'd abandoned. She discovered she was pregnant on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after she landed. She sat on the bathroom floor for a long time after the test confirmed what she already suspected her body had been, trying to tell her, one hand spread flat across her stomach, and she had what she would later describe to no one as the longest conversation of her life, entirely internal, entirely without resolution, about what came next. She thought about calling him. She picked up her phone 4 times, set it down 4 times. Because what would she say? I heard you. I heard everything. And now I am carrying your child in a country you don't know I've gone to, and I need you to tell me that what I heard was wrong. She had spent 2 years learning every room of this man. She knew what his silences meant. She knew when he was protecting her and when he was simply protecting himself. And she could not, would not, put her child in the middle of a story she didn't understand the ending of. She had left to protect herself. Now she stayed hidden to protect both of them. The weeks became months. Her stomach grew and the Atlantic light changed, and she learned the names of the fishermen who passed beneath her window at dawn, and some mornings she almost believed she had made the right choice. Some mornings she even almost slept. She named him in her head, a boy. She was sure of it somehow, the way she had been sure of Feng Chu that first night across a rain-soaked street, the kind of knowing that lived below thought. She hadn't told anyone. She kept the name in a private place inside her chest and took it out sometimes when the loneliness pressed too close. And it was enough. It had to be enough. In Seoul, the Dragon of Busan did not eat. He sat at the head of tables he didn't taste food at. Attended meetings he processed through the surface layer of his mind, while everything beneath was running the same search on a continuous loop. Her studio had been empty when his men checked it. Her apartment was cleared out, her Korean phone number disconnected. The airline records had taken 4 days to access, and when they did, they told him she had left on a red-eye to Lisbon under her own name, unconcerned apparently with being followed, and then nothing beyond that point. He dismantled her digital footprint looking for a thread to pull. He found a remote design contract registered to a company with a Portuguese mailing address. He found a bank transfer. He found a post office box in a coastal town west of Lisbon. He found the name of a pharmacist. He found the name of a clinic. The clinic record stopped him cold. He read it twice, 3 times. Sat with it alone in his office for 40 minutes with no one permitted to enter, and when he stood up, something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of him. Not broken, reconfigured around a new and absolute point of gravity. She was pregnant. His child was growing up in a Portuguese fishing town, while he had been burning down every intelligence network in Asia trying to find her. He could have moved immediately. Every instinct he had, and they were sharp, honed instincts, the kind you develop when the cost of being slow is measured in lives, told him to get on a plane that night. He didn't, because the clinic record had come from a source inside his own network. And the only people who had known about Jenica, the only people who could have handed her information that would make her run, were people who had been in that building the night of the meeting with Adeze. He needed to know who had helped her misunderstand what she'd heard before he showed up at her door. He spent 6 weeks finding out. What he found changed everything he thought he knew about the night she disappeared and about the woman who had been standing in that room with him. He boarded a plane on a gray November morning, told no one where he was going except his second-in-command and his driver. Took one vehicle, no visible security. Arrived in Cascais as evening was settling over the cobblestones and the fishing boats were coming in across the harbor. He had the address. He was already out of the vehicle when he saw her. Standing outside the small cafe on the harbor lane, the warm light of the window catching the curve of her cheek. Long natural hair loose around her shoulders. Beige coat open over a cream dress, pulled tight across a stomach that told him everything his investigator's report had prepared him for, and still, nothing had prepared him for. The dragon tattoo flexed across his hand as his fingers stilled at his sides. She turned. And the moment her eyes found his across the wet cobblestones, he watched every wall she had built across 6 months of running go rigid with the effort of holding. He did not move toward her. Not yet. He let her see him. Let her understand that the search was finished. Let the rain fall between them in the silence where every lie that had been constructed to separate them now trembled under the weight of how much time they had both lost. He had crossed 3 continents and broken every rule he'd made about keeping her separate from his world. And she was standing there carrying his son. He would burn the rest of the story down to find the truth. Starting now.
He said her name first. Not a question. Not an accusation. Her name. The way he had always said it. With the particular weight of someone who understood that words were tools and chose them accordingly. And had chosen this one to mean I see you and I found you and don't run all at once. Jenica didn't run. Her legs wouldn't have permitted it. She stood on the wet cobblestones with the Atlantic pushing cold air up the harbor lane and looked at the man she had spent 6 months grieving. Because that was what it had been, a grief, the specific and devastating kind reserved for people who are still alive but lost to you, and said, nothing at all. He crossed the street slowly, stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she could see the rain on his coat, the controlled stillness of his expression, and beneath it, barely, in the way you can sometimes see a current moving under still water, something that was neither controlled nor still at all. His eyes dropped once more to her stomach, came back to her face. How long? He said quietly. 6 months. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Almost 7. Something moved through him. A single long breath released through his nose. Then he reached out, slowly giving her every opportunity to step back, and placed one hand, the tattooed one against the side of her stomach. She should have pulled away, she didn't. The baby moved. A small, decisive roll, as if he already knew the difference between strangers and this. Feng Chu went very still under that movement, his eyes dropping closed for just a moment, and Jinika felt something crack open in the carefully constructed wall she had been reinforcing for 6 months. She stepped back anyway, because the wall was necessary, because a single tender moment in the rain was not an explanation, and she needed an explanation more than she needed comfort. "I heard you," she said. "That night, I was in the corridor." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know." The 2 words landed like stones in still water. "You know," she repeated. "I know what you heard. And I know what you were meant to hear." He said it quietly, evenly, without looking away from her face. "They are not the same thing, Jinika." She let him into the cafe because it was raining, and because her back ached, and because some stubborn, inconvenient part of her had always been incapable of refusing him a hearing. They sat at a corner table, away from the window, while the fisherman at the bar paid them no attention, and the owner refilled her tea without being asked. He laid it out with the same precision he applied to everything, methodically, without embellishment, watching her face the way he always had, calibrating. The meeting with Adeze had not been a courtship. It had been a security arrangement, a formal agreement, brokered through Adeze as the family's eldest, to place Janika's family under his protection network, while Janika herself remained concealed from the men who had been mapping his personal life looking for leverage. Adeze's name on the arrangement, not Ginika's, because putting Ginika's name anywhere near his formal business was the same as painting a target on her. The marriage language had been legal structure, not romantic intention, a term used in certain underworld contracts to denote binding obligation and full financial responsibility. He had been trying to keep her safe. Ginika sat with this for a long moment, turning it over carefully, looking for the angle where it stopped making sense. She couldn't find one. "Then why didn't she tell me?" she said. "Adeze. If she knew what it was, why did she let me believe?" "That," he said, "is the question I spent 6 weeks answering before I came here." He placed a folder on the table between them. She didn't want to open it. She sat looking at it for nearly a full minute, her hand resting on top of it, while something cold and quiet settled in her chest. The particular dread of someone who suspects the truth and is not yet ready to stop hoping they're wrong. Adeze at a restaurant in Gangnam, seated across from a man Jinika didn't recognize, though she could tell from the way the table was framed, the quality of the security detail visible at the edges, that he was not someone ordinary. Records of communications, a transfer of money she couldn't trace to any source she recognized, and then a transcript, 6 pages, of a conversation her sister had conducted 3 days before Jinika had stood in that corridor. She read it twice. Adeze had known exactly when Janika would be in the building that night. She had positioned herself, extracted the portion of the conversation she needed, isolated the 4 words that would detonate everything, and ensured Ginika overheard them stripped of every surrounding sentence that would have made them mean something different. She had then contacted the man in the photograph, a rival of Feng Chu's, a man whose name moved through the underworld the way smoke moves through a burning building, and told him where Ginika had gone. Not to hurt Ginika. That was the part that took Ginika longest to absorb, not out of hatred, out of wanting. Adeze had wanted Feng Chu with the kind of hunger that justifies to itself almost anything. She had looked at her younger sister's hidden life, and decided it should be hers instead. And when removing Ginika from the equation wasn't enough, when Feng Chu began his search and it became clear he was not going to stop, the wanting had curdled into something much more dangerous. Ginika set the folder down, her hands were steady. She found that strange. She had expected to feel the floor move beneath her, the way it had in that corridor 6 months ago, but this was different. This was not the shock of a wound opening. This was something closer to a door swinging shut on a version of the past she could finally stop inhabiting. "She told them where I was," Ginika said. "Yes." "She's still in contact with them." "Yes," he said it without softening it. He had never softened things for her, and she had always loved him for it, and loved him for it now. She looked up from the folder, found him watching her with that expression she had spent 2 years learning. The one that lived beneath the composure, the one that was only ever visible when no performance was required. "I should have asked you," she said quietly. "I should have walked through that door and asked you what I heard." "You should have," he agreed. And then, after a moment, "I should have told you what I was doing instead of managing it alone. We both had the same flaw." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "You're not supposed to agree with me when I'm criticizing myself. I'm not in the habit of letting you take more than your share of anything," he said, "even blame. It did not happen all at once. That was not how trust rebuilt itself, not the kind that had been shattered by real grief, and real months and a child grown in the space of what was lost. It happened slowly, in the small hours and ordinary moments that accumulated quietly into something solid. He stayed in Kaski. He did not ask her permission for this. He simply appeared each morning at a reasonable hour and remained until a reasonable time in the evening. And somewhere in the second week, she stopped noting it as a decision he was making and started experiencing it as a fact of the day, like the tide coming in. He attended her prenatal appointment on a Wednesday, sitting in the clinic chair with his long frame folded into a space clearly not designed for men of his dimensions, studying the ultrasound image with an expression of such focused, almost reverent concentration that the midwife forgot herself entirely and began explaining things to him he hadn't asked about. He asked about everything. He purchased 3 books on fetal development and read them with the same systematic intensity he applied to intelligence reports. He learned the name she had been keeping in the private place inside her chest and said it once, quietly, in the dark kitchen of her apartment when he thought she was asleep in the next room. She had been awake. She did not say anything. She pressed her face into the pillow and let the tears come silently and privately, and when she emerged in the morning she found him already there with coffee and the specific pastry from the harbor bakery she had mentioned wanting. Exactly once, 3 days prior, the wall came down in pieces. She didn't try to take it down and she didn't try to hold it up. She simply stopped maintaining it, and gravity did the rest. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after he had stepped out of that black SUV into the rain, she reached across the kitchen table and covered his tattooed hand with both of hers. He turned his palm up and held on. Nothing was said, nothing needed to be. The morning a Daisy arrived in Casksi's, Janika was alone. Feng Chu had returned to Seoul for 48 hours. There were matters that could not be handled remotely. Loose ends connected to the rival who had been feeding Adieze information, a situation that needed his physical presence to resolve cleanly. He would be back by Friday. It was Wednesday, 2 days. Ginika had told no one she was going to the harbor market that morning. She went because the vendor who sold the hand-dyed linen she had been using for small projects only came on Wednesdays, and because the walk was good for her back, and because she had spent 3 weeks in careful, structured safety, and had let herself forget, briefly, that the danger had not been fully resolved yet. Her sister was waiting at the end of the market lane. Adieze looked exactly as she always had, impeccable, composed jewelry catching the thin winter light. She smiled when she saw Ginika, the warm, familiar smile Ginika had loved her whole life, and for a single disorienting moment Ginika was 12 years old again, and the world had not yet taught her what that smile could conceal. "I needed to see you," Adieze said. "I needed to explain, Adieze. Please." She took Ginika's arm gently. "Just come and sit with me, somewhere private. Give me 10 minutes. She should have known. She had read the folder. She had seen the transcript. She knew what her sister had done and what she was capable of, and she knew, in the part of herself that processed threat the way Feng Chu had quietly taught her to, that she should take her phone out of her pocket right now and make a call. But this was her sister, and grief makes fools of even the careful. The car was waiting around the corner. Ginika realized it was wrong the moment the door closed. The locks engaging before she reached for the handle. The driver unknown, Adaize's expression shifting from soft to something harder and more frightened and more desperate all at once. "I'm sorry," Adieze said. And she sounded like she meant it, which was somehow the worst part. "He'll never stop looking for you as long as you're free. This is the only way to end it." The car moved. Ginika pressed her hand to her stomach and breathed. Feng Chu's phone rang at 4:47 in the morning Seoul time, his second in command. 2 sentences. He was moving before the second one finished. The location had come from the tracking application he had installed on Janika's phone 6 days ago, telling her it was there, showing her exactly how to disable it if she wanted to. She had not disabled it. He had not commented on that, but he had noted it with the quiet precision he applied to every significant thing. The signal placed her at a decommissioned coastal fortress 40 minutes north of Casksi's, a property connected, through 3 layers of shell companies, to the rival family Adieze had been working with. He was on a plane in under 2 hours. He arrived at the fortress as the sun was going down behind low clouds, gray light turning everything the color of old steel. His men had already established a perimeter. The rival security inside numbered 11, manageable. He gave his instructions in 4 sentences. Then he went through the gate himself, because there was not a version of this situation in which he waited outside. The fortress interior was cold stone and bad lighting, and the sound of the Atlantic battering the seawall below. He moved through it quickly, efficiently, following the signal on his phone. The sounds of his men working through the outer rooms behind him were something he registered and filed away. He was focused on the corridor ahead, on the door at the end of it, on what was behind that door. He heard her before he reached it. Not screaming, breathing, The specific, controlled, rhythmic breathing of someone in pain who has decided to manage it rather than surrender to it. He recognized it as something she had clearly been practicing without his knowledge. He opened the door. A Daisy was standing at the far wall, backed against it, watching him with an expression that moved through defiance and fear, and something almost like relief in the space of 2 seconds. Ginika was on the floor with her back against the stone wall, knees drawn up, both hands pressed to her stomach, and her eyes when they found him carried 6 months of running, and 3 weeks of rebuilding, and every complicated, necessary, earned thing that had grown between them, all of it sharpened down to one single clear point. "Your timing," she said through her teeth, "could have been slightly better." He crossed the room and was on the floor beside her in the same movement. "How far apart?" he said. 3 minutes. Maybe less now. Ade said something from the far wall. He didn't look at her. He had people for that. One of his men appeared in the doorway, and he issued 2 quiet instructions. One regarding his enemies in the building, one regarding his sister-in-law, and returned his entire attention to Ginika. "Look at me," he said. She already was. "I have you," he told her. Simply and completely. The way he did everything that mattered. She grabbed his tattooed hand and held it with a strength that surprised him and shouldn't have. Because he had known for 3 weeks now what she was made of, what she had always been made of, and it was something that did not break. Their son was born 40 minutes later in a decommissioned fortress on the Portuguese coast while the Atlantic raged outside in Feng Chu's. Men secured the building floor by floor, and Daisy was led away into the cold in handcuffs, her composure finally completely gone. He was small and furious and perfect. Feng Chu held him first because Ginika, exhausted and laughing and crying in the same breath, placed him there herself. He held his son the way he held everything he intended to keep, with absolute certainty, with the full weight of his attention, with no part of himself withheld. He looked up and found Ginika watching him. "The name," she said quietly. "The one you said in the kitchen." He looked at her for a moment. "You were awake. I was always awake," she almost smiled. "Say it again. Properly this time." He said it. In the ruined fortress with the sea at the walls and the last of the danger bleeding out of the building around them, he said the name they had each kept privately in the months they had spent apart, without knowing the other was keeping it too. And that was the beginning. Not the end of pain. There would be more of that, the slower work of trust fully rebuilt, of a Daisy's consequences meeting her, of a life restructured around honesty rather than protection and concealment. But the beginning of what came after all of it. The thing that the heartbreak and the running and the searching and the rain-soaked cobblestone street had all been moving toward without either of them knowing. A family. Improbable, hard-won, entirely real. The Dragon of Busan, who had terrified politicians and broken open every intelligence network on 3 continents to find one woman, sat on a cold stone floor in Portugal with his son in his arms, and looked at the mother of his child like she was the only fixed point in a world that had always been moving too. Fast, she looked back the same way. Outside, the Atlantic kept going. The tide came in, the light changed, and for the first time in 6 months, neither of them was running. Thanks for watching.